Hey, y'all. I'm Andrea.
And I'm Christopher.
And we are two friends who think it's very important for us to talk about race in America.
Yeah, so welcome to episode 2 of Decentering Whiteness, a racial justice journey. 2, peace. And today's episode, I think, is going to have 2 aspects to it that I think are a critical part of this question. And that is, why is it so damn hard to talk about race?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a white perspective on that. I think there's a Black perspective on that. And I think there's a collective perspective. Yes. And my objective is to sort of explore all 3 of those and try and bring some light to the table.
Yeah. And it's important for us to just put this out there that with this podcast, there will be episodes where your voice will be the main voice of the episode, right? There will also be episodes where my voice is the predominant main voice. And then there will be episodes like the first episode that we did where it was, equally balanced. And so I think that in this particular episode, it's really important for you to share your perspective. Of course, I'll share mine and I'll interject when it's necessary. But I think that this episode, you really need to share your story. And because it tells a story of how you, a white man, got to be where you are on your own particular racial justice journey. Because I've been Black my whole life, right? So this racism and racial justice and injustice, none of this stuff is new to me. Have I experienced everything? No, right? I have not, and thank God I have not. But the idea of racial justice is not new to me. And so there's no big coming out story, if you will, for me, like it is for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And, the reason I'm here to tell my story has a purpose. And, it's the belief that we're all on some kind of journey with this issue, hence the title of the podcast, to try and understand how to relate to it. And, to me, the first question when we started discussing topics that came up was, why have I never talked about this my entire life?
Mm.
Why has this question not even been in my consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
And what had to happen to get it there?
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully in telling that story to everybody, it will help them figure out where they are in their journey, will inspire them to do some homework and some inventory of their own lives, and will spark whatever consciousness or realization that it does or not in them. And that's really my prayer and my wish is that hopefully in hearing some of what we have to say, that it's going to spark you to think differently about this. Because who we're really trying to talk to in this podcast are good people.
Yes.
Who want to be better.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's at the core of what we want to start out talking about today. And that is, why is it so hard? And in order to do that, we have to talk about a little history, right?
Yes.
So, I'm not going to go all the way back to 1776, but I could.
Okay.
Because I got myself educated. Okay.
Preach. No.
And high school American history was not going to do it for me. I had to go beyond that. But that's a different topic for a different time. Mm-hmm. The bottom line is, we've seen it in all of the films and portrayals of that era that we've seen, that for many centuries, racism was overt.
Yes.
It was the norm.
Yep.
We had a white narrative in this country that the white man was superior to the Black man.
Yep.
And that's what kept that system in place for centuries.
Yep.
But then, around the 1960s and 70s, Martin Luther King, his message resonated with a lot of people. And the movement that he continued on the backs of many people before him, and that many people since then have continued, has brought the equation into consciousness that racism equals evil. Okay? So that overt racism that used to exist went underground.
Yes. Yes.
Because if racism equals evil, and I am a good person,
Yeah.
as we all believe we are, right? Most of us
Right.
believe, a fundamentally held belief, I am good, then I can't be a racist because
Yes.
racism equals evil.
Yep.
But this creates a cognitive dissonance
Woo!
in white people in America that makes it impossible to talk about race. Because how could I be racist, or how could I engage in any racist behavior if I'm a good person?
Yes.
So this is a paradox that we as white people need to learn to address in ourselves. And I think, for me, the analogy that works for me to help me understand this is we're like fish, right? Mm-hmm. Does a fish know that water exists
right
when it's swam in the water its entire life?
Exactly.
And, unless there's a compelling event, like the water dries up and disappears, then you're going to know, oh, wait a sec, where did that stuff go?
Right.
Or unless you have the momentum to jump out of the water and say, hey, I am now in that which is not water.
Yes.
Can you realize that there's something other than what you understand to be your reality? Right?
Yes.
So getting a little bit esoteric there. But
that's okay. I love it. I'm here for all of that, Christopher.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. So, as a result, it's incredibly uncomfortable for us to talk about that because, we may say, I'm not racist. And of course, that's been the phrase that many people have used this year. And to not realize that actually, maybe you're not racist, but you are participating through the color of your skin.
Yes.
In a system.
Yes.
That's fundamentally racist.
Yes.
In which you derive benefit and privilege.
Come on.
And once you realize that fundamentally changes your responsibility.
Yes.
So, that's the process that I've been going through. And I thought it was important, to spend some time thinking yesterday about how my view of race was shaped as a white person in America. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in Iowa. As I explained in the last episode, I grew up in a relatively diverse school where could I see color? Yes, I could. I'd be lying to say that I didn't.
Right.
Was I prejudiced against people of color in school? I don't think so.
Right.
Was I aware of their experience, of what they were going through? Absolutely not.
Right. Right.
And what I was taught was that by my parents was that racism was wrong, and that it was important to be kind to all people.
Yeah.
But then I tested that against the reality.
Yes.
So here we go. First of all, I have to say, I love my parents.
Yes.
They're wonderful. They're wonderful human beings. They are on this journey with me.
Yes.
Fully. Right. But the reality is, when I was growing up, I can remember specific instances of them using highly charged racist expressions.
Yeah.
So my dad.
What? Can you give examples for those
Sure.
who are like, what does that mean?
Yeah. So my dad, we were on vacation, and I can't remember whether it was in Florida or here in Arizona, but stuff white people do in spring break. And we were driving through a shopping mall parking lot, and a black kid on a bicycle might have cut in front of my dad or something that frustrated him.
Yeah.
And he said something like, damn pickaninny. And first of all, I was only tangentially aware of what that word even meant to begin with.
Right.
But I knew it was racially charged, and so did my sister.
Wow.
And we were on him. So, here we were probably like 16 and 14, and we were all up in his grill telling him, no. So, but that was, and luckily that didn't happen very often.
Right.
And that was just an expression of extreme frustration on his part. But you know what? When people are frustrated or upset, they tell the truth about how they feel. Right?
Yes, they do.
And so that was where he was on his journey at that time. And he's in a different place now. Right. He is a good man. And he is, like I said, he's doing the work now.
Yeah.
But that was one example. I talked in the last episode about, before I went full-time gay, Um, there was a girl in high school or in junior high.
Wait, I gotta stop because when you said the full-time gay, it just cracked me up. So I'm still cracking up over that now, Christopher.
Yeah, so I am what they call a gold star gay, which means I've only ever had relationships with men. But when I was in junior high school, there was a woman, and I won't use her last name. We'll just call her Dr. Denise because she is a physician today and somewhere in Illinois. And I knew when I met her, I was super attracted to her intellect. And she was funny and she was smart. And I just wanted to be around her all the time. So I came home and I told my parents, I really like Denise. I think I might want to ask her out or something like that. And they were not having it. They were not having it. And why? Like I said in the last episode, because, well, think about the children and the discrimination they'd suffer. So there was a message to me.
Yes.
About, okay, it's hard to be Black in America. I was pretty mad. I was pretty mad at them for that. Yeah. And then Denise left the state and went off, and I lost that friendship, which I was really sad about. Mm-hmm. So the other messages I was getting growing up, and by the way, I've talked to my parents about this just yesterday. I said, did you ever have a single friend of color? No. Right? So the entire time growing up, the only people of color in my house were the people who were cleaning it.
Wow.
So what kind of message did that send me?
Yes.
I went to one of the largest United Churches of Christ in the United States, 2,000 plus members, huge historic congregational church in Des Moines. I do not remember. I looked back at pictures yesterday. I could not find a single person of color in my 120 plus person choir. Did we sing a lot of spirituals? Yes. Did they have any credibility or any rhythm? No.
Before you go further, I want to emphasize a point, because as you're telling your story, you're actually being introspective and you're going back. Like you said, you even reached out to your parents. Like, this is a part of when we hear people say, do the work, do your own work. Like, the things that you're doing, that's doing your own work and not just simply sitting with your own thoughts like, oh, dad did or mom did. You're actually going back. Like you said, you talked to them, you looked at pictures. This is a part of the journey.
Well, amen. And what I'm doing is I'm reconstructing my own narrative based on the truth.
Yes.
And not on my perceived wish.
Yes.
To be a good person who isn't racist and who, didn't have a racist upbringing and all that kind of stuff. Now, was it conscious? No. But in doing this work, I understand that it was there and that I had privilege in that process growing up. So, the other stuff I thought about were any doctors or dentists that were people of color. Never. And now get this. This is what really rocked my world. And I did some hard research on this topic. So I looked at my zip code that I grew up in Des Moines. And I lived in a fairly wealthy area called South of Grand. The zip code has north of Grand and south of Grand. So I was able to look at the 2010 census records and say, okay, how many people lived in that zip code? Because I could think of not a single neighbor of color in my immediate neighborhood. But then I thought about this entire part of Des Moines.
Wow.
And when I did the math, I could pretty much figure out that there, of course, the zip code crossed into another area of town that was less affluent. And so that's how we got to maybe 10 or 12% minority population in that area.
Right.
But in my part, I bet it was under 1%. And I can't even think of a single person of color in that entire part of town that I grew up in. Segregated as could possibly be all the way through the 80s and 90s. And I asked my dad, are you even aware of any person of color living in that entire place? And he said, well, there's one doctor I could think of, and he was really well-to-do. And that, and he said, and this was an interesting phrase, and you and I discussed this. He said, I just don't think in that era, people of color had the wealth to be able to live there. And maybe true, obvious exceptions, but I'm also pretty sure that there was some redlining going on.
Yes.
That just didn't have people feeling welcome there either.
Exactly. And for those of you who are curious about redlining, this is an instance where I'm going to have you to Google it. At first, I was going to talk about it, but you know what? This is something that you need to research and understand for yourself because, like hearing me talk about it, it may seem like I'm being a bit biased. So redlining is a real thing where it prohibited people of color, not just Black people, but all people of color from basically moving to the suburbs. And to say, even during like the election season, when we heard Trump talking about, listen, I'm saving your suburbs, blah, blah, blah. He was actually going back to that particular era where redlining was legal or basically discriminating against people based on the color of their skin as it related to housing was actually legal. So yeah, it's a real thing. This is something I want to ask all of you out there who are listening to Google redlining and learn about it. So
yeah. And, frankly, if I were a person of color, would I even want to live in any of those neighborhoods as a pioneer, not knowing what I would expect?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know for a fact you moved into your neighborhood, which was predominantly white, as a conscious process, and checking out your neighbors and knowing what you were getting yourself into and having the bravery to say, this is something I want to consciously do.
Yep.
That's very 2020 of you. I'm not sure that I would have had the courage to do something like that in the 70s, 80s, 90s when I came up. So,
right. And, and there have been a lot of people of color in particular, who have decided, you know what, this is best for my family, especially after redlining became illegal in the 70s, who decided, you know what, I want to move my family into the suburbs and all of that. So by no means am I like the only one, obviously. And I know that's not what you're saying, but I do want to, I stand on the shoulders of those who came before me, who were brave enough to move out into the suburbs and all of that. But yeah, for me, it was definitely an intentional process. I would have loved to live in middle upper class Black neighborhood, right? In Wisconsin, it doesn't exist. It just doesn't. I would have loved to move to an extremely diverse area in Wisconsin that, to be told, it just doesn't exist. And so then I had to think, kind of outside the box. So.
Well, and we see that in the gay community as well, that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that we had the gay ghetto.
Wow, that's interesting.
Of course, we wanted to live with people who were going to make us feel welcome and safe for who we were.
Right.
And, that's decreasing exponentially today as homophobia decreases in our society. Not that it's a battle that's completely won, but, I live among, endless quantity of straight people in my neighborhood.
I love how you said that.
And I feel safe and good here, so
right.
Hopefully we get there for everybody.
Right.
But, that was another message that I got growing up. And the last one that I want to mention is, and this one blew my mind, in 18 years of formal education, from kindergarten through grad school, master's, I cannot think that I ever took a single class from an African-American instructor or educator. So if I go back down my list, the message that I got growing up is Black people are not good enough to be your parents' friends. Black people are not good enough to educate you in school.
Wow.
The one I didn't mention was Black people are not good enough to work with your father in 40 years in the legal profession.
Wow.
Black people are not good enough to go to your church.
Wow.
Not good enough to live in your neighborhood. Not good enough to give you medical or dental care. And, that was...
And not good enough to marry, because remember your parents said, think about your children, right?
Yeah, Dr. Denise just wasn't good enough, even though she was... growing up, I'm not sure I ever had my parents tell me they wanted me to marry a doctor, but wasn't good enough. And so, that's just a small taste.
Right.
But the bottom line is that was my reality. And I never thought about that list consciously until yesterday. And like you said, I involved my parents in that discussion, which raised their consciousness as a result as well.
Yeah.
I involved my entire high school class on Facebook. And guess who chimed in? From 1997, or no, excuse me, 1987, my graduation year, my high school principal chimed in and gave me the authoritative perspective that in his entire career as principal of that school, which he's partially responsible for, but he also hired a Black vice principal who was from the gods.
Yeah.
Amazing.
From the gods.
Yes, snatched. Amazing, powerful, intelligent, inspirational woman. So at least I got that message.
Yes.
But that was about it. So I went through that process of having that dialogue with everybody in my life. And together we reconstructed that story of my life to say, hey, this was your privilege.
Yeah.
This was how you grew up. And these were all the messages you got. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was too busy processing the messages about you're not good enough because you're gay.
Right.
You're going to hell. You're never going to be happy. You're never going to find love, all that kind of stuff. So I was busy with that.
Right.
But now that I got that sorted out, I look back at this reality and I think, it's overwhelming.
Yes.
And no wonder we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
Because it's so difficult to process.
Yeah.
The fact that my, formation, my training as a human being was that skewed.
Yes.
And was that one-sided. And that I was given, nobody tells us you should be racist, you should discriminate against people of color. But you get all those messages. What's the possible result in your mind and in your psyche?
Yes. And that's called unconscious bias, right? I mean, that's where unconscious bias comes from because your parents, with the exception of, like you said, your dad using charged language, they never said explicitly, Black people are not good enough to do this. They're not good enough to do that, right? But that was the message that they were sending to you. And that's why it's so important for white people, I mean, and everybody really, but especially white people when it comes to the racial justice journey to really examine their unconscious biases.
Well, and then on top of that, and this is actually pretty insidious. There were small pieces of evidence that I could pick up, like Vice Principal Everidge. See, Black people do have opportunity if they just work hard enough. Right?
Yeah.
Or the fact that my dad said, well, yeah, there was a Black doctor in our neighborhood at one point, but he was very successful and worked very hard to earn what he had.
Yeah.
And so all these counterexamples that are brought up to say, see, there are Black people who succeed because they're the ones that are trying.
Yes.
And that essentially tries to undermine the concept of white privilege by saying it doesn't exist because if you try hard enough as a Black person, you can attain privilege.
Yep.
And that's an insidious message. It is propaganda.
Yes.
That we bring into our minds to try and disprove the unavoidable truth that this country is not equal.
Yes. It's like they say there was a saying back in the day where they said, you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? And I've always said for a number of years, it's like, but what if people don't even have boots? You know what I mean? It's like, then where do we go from there? So this idea that people can be self-made or pull themselves up, or like you said, that, see, Black people can make it if they only work hard enough. It's like, what kind of statement is that? But again, it's these subtle messages that are sent that sits in our psyche, right? In our unconscious mind. And so that when we meet people, we automatically judge them if they're successful, like a white person meets a Black person and they're successful. And they're like, they got to be a hard worker because they're successful. And then the opposite is also true, that if you see like a Black homeless person, it's like, oh, they're homeless because they're lazy, when neither one of those, it doesn't have to be true. You know what I mean?
And these are all narratives that go centuries back
Yep.
to the original justifications for slavery
Yep.
and the entire social construction of race.
Yep.
Because if you turn down your melanin level, you and I look the same on the inside.
Right.
And you and I have the same.
Or if you brought yours up now.
Yes. Hello. Okay.
Bring yours up. I'm willing. I want you to bring yours up. Okay.
I got some special drops for that No, I'm happy with mine, and I'm happy with yours the way they are.
Right? Exactly.
But the point is that race is a socially constructed concept.
It is.
It doesn't exist. You have an ethnicity. You have where the people who came before you are from. You have a cultural identity. That's how you define.
Well, we all do.
Yeah, and so I'm saying you in the sense of all of us, right?
Yep.
So I'm a white man of European origin who identifies as gay, and I'm primarily German, and I speak these languages, and so we're complex. We have intersectional identities. Mm-hmm. Where someone who sees your husband on the street might think there's an African American man.
Right.
So someone who sees me on the street might think and listens to me might think I'm an American man. But guess what? Surprise! I have a Dutch passport and not an American one.
Yep.
So we're complex human beings, and at the end of the day, trying to define us by those lazy, hardworking, smart, not so smart, those are labels that were put on us to try and divide us and to try and justify oppression.
Yes.
And those are the things that we need to tear down. And the only way, so hashtag educate yourself. In my course this summer, we watched a ton of different YouTube videos in which people were talking about how they identified. People who are Dominican, for instance, who don't identify as Black, they identify as Hispanic culturally.
Yes, they do. Yep. And that's actually why, for those of you who don't know, they ask you when it comes to like your race, sometimes it'll only be white, not Hispanic, or Black, Hispanic, or they'll put that in there because for that reason, there are a lot of Dominicans, there are a lot of like Afro-Cubans who they don't identify as Black. They identify either as Cuban or as Dominican, or as whatever.
Well, and, I've seen that in my own life. My father-in-law, God rest his soul, had lived his entire life he's from Amsterdam, but in mostly rural Netherlands. And I would bring people home to meet him and my mother-in-law who would confuse the heck out of him. Like, for instance, a woman who presented as Korean, but she was adopted and grew up in Sweden.
Ah, yes.
So, he wanted to ask her all sorts of questions about kimchi and bulgogi and bibimbap, which, she knew nothing about, right? Because she was Swedish.
Exactly.
One of my best friends from when I went to university in Spain was Kenyan, Kikuyu, but his entire life was spent growing up almost in the US because his father was a Christian missionary from Africa to the US. And so he didn't identify necessarily as African.
Right.
Because he grew up in the US, but he didn't identify as African American.
Right.
Because he wasn't.
Yep.
And so, that's how I learned at a very young age that identity is intersectional, it's complex, and the only way that you can understand someone and classify them is not by looking at them.
Right.
It's by knowing them.
By knowing them, exactly.
And by listening to their story, if they're willing to tell it.
Yes.
Right? Which is a privilege to hear, not a right.
Exactly.
So all this, and this is another topic for another podcast, but sometimes asking people where they're from is a microaggression. No,
honestly, I'm going to say like most of the time. And I learned this from my husband because I shared, in the first episode that he's from Haiti. And so the number one question he gets when he meets people is like, where are you from? And it's like, what do you mean? Where am I from? Because that automatically assumes and insinuates that, oh, wait, you're not from here. You're not one of us. You're different when you ask someone, where are they from? Like it's rude. It's let me just tell you, it's flat out rude. If you want to know where someone is from, get to know them, become their friend. And if the door opens to learn where they're from, or even if you hear them speaking a different language, it's like, oh, what language is that? Then that might tell you a little bit more. But to simply ask someone, where are you from? And as a Black woman, a Black American woman, I get that question all the time because a lot of my years have been spent in white spaces. We left the inner city when I was 15 and we moved out to the suburbs, and I spent 23 years of my life going to school with them, undergrad, graduate school, working around mostly white people. And when I would meet new white people, they'd be like, where are you from? And you know me, Christopher. Sometimes I'd be like, well, my mom and dad met in 1976 and then they got married in 78 and then they had sex and that's where I'm from. You know what I mean? Like,
well, I know why they ask where you're from. Because you look like an African princess. That's why.
Oh, well, yeah.
Royalty.
Yeah. But no, but that question, just don't ask it. If you are not friends with someone, you have no right to know where they're from. And I'm not just talking about just Black people. If you meet an Asian person, if you meet a Caribbean, like don't ask them where they're from, because it's really not your business. And really, it has nothing to do with the conversation, especially if y'all talking about shoes.
So you know what my perspective is on that? As someone who's lived in 3 other countries besides this one, it tires the shit out of me to answer that question every single time somebody asks it.
Yep.
And number 2, if the question after that is, why don't you come over, is not, why don't you come over to my house for dinner? Then I don't want to hear from you.
Yeah.
Okay. Because there's so many people who are just, they want to classify you, put you in a box.
Yep.
Know, how you fit into their taxonomy and then move on.
Yep.
So to bring it back to the topic that we're discussing is why is it so difficult to talk about race? Yeah. It's because we want to confine that topic to what we can see and what we, with our current understanding, can classify and make feel safe to us.
Yeah.
So, I've long had a theory about the human mind that if someone says they can't see color or don't see color, I think that is at best a lack of awareness and at worst a bold-faced lie. Because I think as animals, our minds are what I've always called a differential engine. It's about seeing the differences in other people so that we can classify that as safe or not safe.
Exactly.
And if I look at you and you're different than me, then I think my limbic response is not safe. Got to keep an eye on that.
Yes.
So I think in reality, we also have some biology to overcome as human beings.
Yep.
And that all starts out, and by the way, I would imagine that applies to people of color as well for white folk, with probably better justification.
Not necessarily. That different is bad. That's not true, because unlike your experience of like really never having interacted with a Black person, Black people or people of color don't necessarily have that experience where they've never interacted with a white person, a doctor, teachers. Most of my educators growing up, they were white. And I went to, all of my schooling was public. It was always public school. Some of them were in Black neighborhoods. Some of them were in suburban neighborhoods. Most of my educators were white. So it's not the same when it comes to Black people. And again, and of course, I'm not speaking for all Black people or all people of color, just like you're not speaking for, all white people. That's why we're sharing our perspective with the hopes that someone can relate to what we're saying. Yeah. And not only that, listeners, but we would love to, hear your perspectives on these topics as we discuss things. Like we want to hear from you, like leave them in the comments. Reach out to us, right? Because we want to know what your perspective is, and we can share them, because there's still room for both of us to learn and grow. Yeah,
and having these conversations and especially sharing your realizations with us about when you came to consciousness about racism existing in ways that you didn't imagine it did when you were younger, and things like that. Would be really curious to hear about. But I think it's important to understand, I did go to school with, I think, 10% African American students in my school. I had fantastic friendships with them. The point I was making earlier was simply, I did not see any adults in positions of leadership, power, privilege, or anything of that nature. And I guess my sort of tacit assumption as a child would have been that none of my classmates were going to be destined for that either, because none of us had any role models for that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I can't even imagine. I mean, for me to not see any African American role models growing up other than maybe entertainment and sports,
right?
To me, that sent one message. Oh my God, I can't even imagine the message that it would have sent to you or to my fellow classmates about, engendering serious questions of, are you capable of this? Are you good enough for this? That has to be painful. And I can't even imagine the horror of not having those role models in my life.
Yeah, I mean, but even beyond that, it's so I shared that I was a retired accountant, right? And I used to get a lot of, when I worked in corporate, a lot of people to reach out to me who wanted me to come and speak to their particular, the high school students, right? Because there's a shortage of Black accountants really like nationwide. And so they wanted me to come and speak to them so they can see like a living example of a successful accountant, because very few Black people like go into accounting. And the reason why they don't necessarily go into it is because they don't have that representation, right? And so if the only thing that's in front of you is someone who, plays basketball or football or whatever it is, then especially as a Black man, then, okay, you're going to think, well, that's all there is for me. But again, I think representation matters, and it doesn't matter whether it relates to race, whether it relates to gender, whether it relates to profession,
sexual orientation.
Yeah, exactly. So it representation always matters. And so this idea of like me not necessarily and other Black people not necessarily seeing the example, like we've all experienced that to some level, right? It just may not be as harmful as, like the racial angle, but we've all experienced not seeing ourselves represented in a space and feeling some sort of way about it and having to reconcile that feeling.
Yeah, and I dealt with that growing up as a young gay kid who was very aware of my sexuality already when I was 12 years old, and I would see gay people represented on TV occasionally. That was back in the period of there being some movies like, unfortunately, a lot of them were related to AIDS in the beginning.
Yeah.
But there was one called Longtime Companion, Doing Time on Maple Drive. These were like ABC Movie of the Week in the 80s. And I would hide in my bedroom under the covers, praying my parents wouldn't come in and hear that I was watching these TVs, because I didn't want these TV shows. I didn't want to get caught, just so that I could see people like me.
Exactly.
At all.
Yep.
At all.
Yep.
Because, it's not like you can see us unless your gaydar is really, really good.
Right.
At 100 feet. So I can, to some extent, relate to what feels like to not be represented. And it's horrible. And so, I think as we struggle with these questions of how to talk about this, how to raise consciousness of this, hearing each other's experiences is critical. Examining our past and revising our personal histories to be authentic and true to reality is really key and really critical to all of this.
We just really wanted to, talk about why is it so hard for people to talk about race, specifically white people to talk about it? Because from my perspective, it's not hard for Black people to talk about race. And we're going to have an episode on colorism, which I'll take the lead on that. But, it's hard for all of the reasons that you mentioned, right, in this episode, but it's not an excuse to not talk about it.
No, it's not. And that's why I really wanted to bring up an interesting quote that just happened to cross my path the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And that talks to a couple things, which we'll unpack after this. So the quote is, the race question cannot be settled without a profound change of heart on the part of white America. It's not just a question of a little bit more goodwill and generosity. It's a question of waking up to the crying injustices and deep-seated problems which are ingrained in the present setup.
Mm.
So, you might think that quote came post George Floyd this year, but that quote is from a Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, in his book To a White Priest, written in 1964.
Mm.
So this is even pre-civil rights movement.
Yes.
And so that question, which is extreme, or that quote, which is extremely relevant this year, today, is 56 years old. So this is how long, and long before that, we've been struggling with this. So, it's a good fight. It's been a long fight, and we're happy to have you with us on this journey of consciousness and racial justice, so that, 10, 20, maybe longer years from now, this quote is going to seem outdated and difficult to understand, just like a lot of things that human beings have evolved past.
Yes.
Are difficult to understand today out of context. So let us hope your children grow up to be adults in a better world as the result of the work of so many good people out there who are either creating content around this topic or consuming with a good heart and a kind and an open, loving heart the content around this topic, so that they can have an authentic, and I would say vulnerable, relationship to this. You cannot address this topic in yourself without getting soft.
Yes.
Without opening your heart and willing to say, you know what? The understanding I have of this might be wrong.
Yes.
And my understanding personally is evolving with every single conversation that I have on this topic.
Yes.
And it's a good fight to be in, people.
Yeah. I agree. So, no, this was good, Christopher. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and, really sharing what your process actually looks like, right? Because there are a lot of people who say, oh, you got to do this work, do your own work, blah, 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 but they don't necessarily share their process. And so thank you for, being open and sharing your process. And I'm sure that it's helped a lot of people who are just unsure of where to begin. And so I think you've shared some great starting points for them to begin their or continue their journey of racial reconciliation on this journey.
And we're going to continue to talk about our own journeys. We're going to continue to, and hopefully in the future, as we bring up maybe a website and other resources, share with you resources that are primary resources that you can access to look into, because so much of the formation of my consciousness on this topic has been because of some, for instance, really awesome work of the New York Times in documenting on YouTube the voices of people of color, talking about race, talking about identity, talking about their personal experiences. Testimony about this topic is highly accessible to us today. And that's a blessing. That is a great blessing. Because if you live like I do in a really lily white world right now, which in retrospect would not have been my choice, but I picked it for whatever spiritual reason I picked it, and this is where I am.
Yeah.
Having access to those voices is critical. And you know what? After having lived 22 years of my life in other countries, after having lived an entire life exposed to diversity, it's a blessing.
Yeah.
It does nothing but enrich my life.
Yes.
And give me a stronger sense of who I am as a person, as an individual, and as a human being.
Yes.
Which is not, I don't pay a cost in any way for that by embracing other people and their identities and who they are. it only makes me better.
Yes.
I just wish people could embrace the richness of that journey and understand what it could bring to them instead of the bubbles that we isolate ourselves in, both intellectually and physically and socially.
Yeah. And I was just going to say the same is true for everyone else who embraces diversity, that, I mean, it will only enhance and enrich your life. It will take nothing away from you. This is really, it's not a zero-sum game where if you embrace, your racial justice journey, that you're taking away from something, leaving everything else behind. But this is a journey of sum, of addition, of accumulation, and you will only be a better human being when you really stop and ask yourself, why is it so hard for me to talk about race? And not just ask the question, but really truly examine, right? Why? And sit back to receive the answers. And the answers, they may not be pretty. They may not be what you expect, but as they come to you, just sit with them and embrace them.
And I think you bring up a really good final point, and that's that conversation that's so difficult is sometimes with other people, but mostly it's with ourselves.
Yes.
And the last thing that I expected when I was sitting at the kitchen table yesterday preparing sort of an outline of what we wanted to talk to about today was to come to such deep realizations about how my past has formed who I am. But it happened because I was willing to ask the questions. I was willing to reach out to people in my environment and seek the viewpoints of people of color that I went to school with.
Mm-hmm.
One of them said that, and this moved me to death, and Marcus, if you're listening to this, thank you for sharing this, is that he sat down, just like every Black student in our school did, with Vice Principal Everidge, to have the talk about the fact that if they wanted to be successful, they were going to have to be better, stronger, better behaved, and stay out of trouble, because trouble was going to find them far too easily if they let it. And thank God for her that they had at least a mentor who could act in their interests and to lift them up and get them to some of the great lives that they have today. Thank God. I didn't need that because I had the whole world to do that for me.
Exactly. Yeah. So we really do hope that y'all have enjoyed this episode of the podcast. And as we said earlier, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, make sure you leave them in the comments, and we promise you that we will respond.
Okay, princess.
Bye, y'all.
I wish I could be as pretty as you.